So what is the question for the night, friends? What's the question for the night? Can you know the world and still love the world? Yes. So I would say is the hardest of all questions. We can talk about that if you want to. Some years ago, I was in my office on Capitol Hill, and I got a call from a woman I'd known for a number of years. She was at the State Department. And she was the China specialist at the State Department, which means she was not a political appointee. She wasn't a Democrat or Republican. She was just the best person who could be hired to understand China for the sake of the United States. And she said, Steve, I have some friends come to Washington in a few weeks. They have a question they want to talk to somebody about. Would you come and do what this for me? I mentioned Václav Havel earlier tonight. He was this poet, playwright, Czechoslovakian, imprisoned in the 1980s, became president inexplicably in 1989. Ideas began to rumble all over the world where people began listening to him. And I took him pretty seriously myself. She called her friends the Václav Havels of China. She said they were the leaders of the Tiananmen Square protest in '89. Because, of course, what happened in '89 in Czechoslovakia had this consequence. '89, the same period of time in Beijing, with another push, and eventually the tanks came in, and we call it the Tiananmen Square Massacre. And she said these are the leaders of the Tiananmen Massacre who made it out, and they have a question. So Meg and I drove Hillendale one night through western Washington, D.C., and up a little hill finally, and there was a big, bright house on the hill, and very bright, orange red doors like the Asians, and we walked in, and it's a house full of late 20s, early 30-something Chinese folk. We had dinner together and sat in a room with a big fireplace. It was in January, and talked for hours and hours that night. And one by one, Jay just walked around the room, each person saying something about their own experience in Tiananmen Square. Most of the nights of life for all of us just kind of come and go over time, don't they? Think, where was I last Tuesday night? I'm not quite sure. A year ago? I'm not sure. But then there's some nights we think, I'm never ever going to forget that night. And that night, I just remember the moment by moments of that night. Because it was person by person telling all of us, telling Meg and me especially, because they were all friends and colleagues. On the one hand, the most terrible things that most of us had never ever imagined. To put it quite simply and poignantly, holding my best friend in my arms as he was bloodied and dying, and then crawling out of Tiananmen Square, hoping I could get away out of Beijing and back and out of China. Some it took a year, some 2 years. Most of them came to North America. These were all people that lived in North America, from Vancouver to Boston, in journalism and graduate schools all across North America. And after hearing these stories of weighty grief, they all said almost the same thing. But you see, we love China. But we love China, you see. But you see, we love China. And we want to go back someday. That's what we want to talk to you about. Because we have a question. And the question is it possible to suffer and to still have a life? Or particularly to press in, we've been talking to people all over the world with our question, asking Hindus, asking Muslims, asking this, we have a question for you because you're a Christian. Does Christianity have a better answer to the question? Is it possible to suffer and to still choose to take up a hard thing in the world, like going back to China and hoping for its future? Could we do that? Because we know that it's likely that if we go back, we'll be imprisoned. We might die, but they said, with all earnest, innocent, hopeful, living something hearts, saying we would do that. Because you see, we love China, but we want to have a good reason for it. And wonder whether Christianity has a better answer to the question. I would just say to you, friends, that that evening has shaped who I am. It's just my life since then. In some ways, raising the ante on a lot of things, raising the stakes on a lot of things that come out and wonder about and believe in. And wondering, of course, as Christian people who confess things to be true Sunday by Sunday, week after week, and the like this. Yes, we confess this. These are our beliefs. The core pillars we believe about God who will these beliefs here. And I see the Creed, the Apostles' Creed, our creedal affirmation. But to confess these things, and the question of these leaders of Tiananmen Square massacre, survivors, was, well, okay, what you confess to be true does it have meaning for somebody like me, who loves China and wants to be part of its future, even if I have to suffer. Can you know the world and still love the world? Some years later, I was invited to go to Beijing to speak at the Beijing Film Academy, which is the major film school in Asia. I'm not a filmmaker, I'm not a film critic. The question I took up with them, with all the several hundred graduate students and the professors one day, was this relationship of good stories to good societies. My thesis was that you can't have a good society without having good stories that somehow run their way through cultural ideas and ways of making sense of what needs to be alive in the world. America, it's Chinese, different places in the world. If the political leadership of China is using language of, we want to become a harmonious society, which I identified that day with them. You're not going to get there apart from good stories that somehow shape who you are as people. And you are the storytellers of the 21st century, the cinematic storytellers of the 21st century in this room. So let's talk about the relation of good stories to good societies. I talked about, there was a translator beside me. I had a manuscript of the presentation. I said a few words, and he said a few words, and we did this for about an hour together. But I talked about one filmmaker in particular, a man named Zhang Yimou, Y-I-M-O-U, Zhang, Z-H-A-N-G. He's the most celebrated filmmaker in China, clearly the last generation. And I talked about several of his best-known films, thinking that they would know them. And if we have a way to talk together, if I talk about this one, they would say, oh, you know that story? Yes, I know that story. How about this story? I know that story. I was looking at this question in each of the films. How do they portray this relationship between what you know and what you know? And especially bringing over this idea of responsibility born of love. Of a responsibility born of love. I didn't mention Hebrew scriptures, Hebrew anthropology, Hebrew epistemology. I didn't go there that day at all. I was just simply saying that at the very heart of what a good story is about, as you see it's at the heart of what a good human being is about, is to see ourselves as responsible for love's sake, for the way things are. So it's extending that out as a thesis for what we think about. I'm looking at several of their best known films as ways to understand what this looks like on screen. Well, Zhang Yimou has been a great storyteller in my life and for many people. I hope this works, friends, because I've been doing this a long time, and technology sometimes works so well, then other times you think, oh, what happened really? But I have this embedded in the next slide. I hope it works, but we'll just try here, okay? It's gonna work.
目前没有什么太好的办法，你可以自己试一下。怎么试？
也是写给我的，你帮我念念吧。
冬天就要过去了，春天如期到来。站在开满黄花的草地上，我们感觉春天真的来了。我回来了。
So if you were looking for a movie to watch one night and you just think, well, isn't the world just happy again this week? It probably wouldn't be this one to watch. If you have room in your heart to think about something deeper, maybe more weighty, I have a hard time thinking about a film that probes into the deepest places like this film does. I'm going to ruin the story for you, so sorry about that. But the story is set in the Cultural Revolution days of China. The man you saw here 20 years earlier, he's a professor, he's in a party setting, says something out loud to somebody who says something about somebody else. All of a sudden he's sentenced to 20 years in a re-education camp, a labor camp. Problem is he's married, his wife is pregnant. He goes off to far away, where he is, nobody really knows. She stays at home and she has a baby. For the next 20 years, she raises this little girl, without a father. She writes letters week after week to her husband. He writes letters week after week to his wife. He comes home finally. The revolution says he's been re-educated. The problem is that she doesn't recognize him. Something traumatic has happened inside here. You can see him talking to the physician there in the office, who says, not much we can do about it, actually. Something has happened inside of her mind, related deeply, of course, to her heart. A trauma of longing and loss and of hope and more hope. And she doesn't know who this man is. So he comes home and he's been waiting for 20 years to be embraced by his wife. And she doesn't know who he is. And she says to him at one point, well, I have these letters here in this big case. Could you read them to me? Of course I could, because of course they're my letters. I get chills even saying those words out loud to him, because he's reading his own words to his wife, who doesn't know that, in fact, her husband's reading what he wrote to her. This is not a film where all the bows are tied up neatly before it's all over. And the question, can you know and still love, is at the heart of the story. Because you see, at a certain point, when the physician says, nothing more than we can really do for her, the question for him has to be, what am I going to do now with my life? What can I do with what I know? That perennial primordial question. I won't ruin it for you completely, but I will say that is the question of the film. Madeleine L'Engle, the remarkably gifted poet who died a few years ago, had a series of 7 poems she called To a Long Loved Love. And my wife and I have often read these out loud to each other, especially when we've had times we having to kind of figure out, can we still talk to each other? Is there too much hurt here? Oh, you said this and I said that, and I need to say any more words to you in my life. And we've sometimes said, well, maybe we could at least try to read these poems aloud to each other as a way to find a way back to each other. To a long loved love, 7 poems, she calls them. this film, one of the most beautiful I've ever seen, embodies a long love. And the question, can you know the world and still love the world? One sense, it's global or cosmic as a question. But of course, eventually it has to come to live like in your house, it has to live in my house. In your life, like in my life. It isn't forever a story far, far away for any of us, as it was, of course, for this man and his wife over time. Can we know, honestly know, and still love? The very heart of what I think vocation is about, actually. For most of us, this question is not so global, not even overtly political, perhaps. Those realities run through every life. But it's more local and very personal. Can I know my neighbor and still love my neighbor? When his bamboo runs amok and into my yard, his bamboo becoming my bamboo, and there are no easy fixes? Can I know my neighbor when her dogs bark all day long, even into the night? And there are no easy fixes, really. But to press in, friends, can my wife know me and still love me? Knowing the frailty of my life, the clay-footedness of my days. I know of no question which is as difficult as this one. Can we know, honestly know, and still love? Well, only if, when we enter into a deeper, truer knowledge of God and his world, seeing that everything about us is born of the reality that God is God and this world is made by God. And therefore, if we're to flourish, it will be because we are near enough to God to hear him calling us, to see what he sees, to hear what he hears, to feel what he feels. A true vocation from God, because it is responding to the voice, the vox of God. You see, these words are always related to each other. Vox, vocal, is the Latin. Vocare, vocation. Vocation it's a good word. It isn't a magic word, but it's a deep word. It's a good word to think about. Because it grows out of the assumption, I'll sing about this tomorrow and on Sunday. But it's the assumption, actually, that we are able to respond, to know, to be responsible, to care. But you see, the assumption of vocare, of vocation, is that we are responsible, able to respond. We're able to hear. As human beings in the world, we're able to hear someone speaking. And who's the someone? Well, if we're able to actually hear that God is God, and we're able to hear what God says, to see what God sees, to feel what God feels. That's what vocation has to mean for all of us. Well, I'm going to give Augustine the last word here. I spoke at a men's retreat this past year to a group of men in Nairobi, actually, political leaders and business leaders in Nairobi. It was a Zoom kind of a thing, which was not so bad. I wish I could have been there. They said, we're meeting by Zoom here, and you speak to us by Zoom. I said, I don't really want to do that. And they said, okay, but we want you to do that. And I said, But anyway, one of the guys who invited me had been a World Bank person in Washington, part of the Falls Church for years we were there, and he always came to things that I was involved in. And when he introduced me to the men's retreat, he said one of the things which was intriguing to me about Steve was that he said, I never thought about me as an African having anything to do with church history. I thought it was sort of like Europe and the West and the North, and of course I was in the Southern Hemisphere, and I was African and Kenyan. He said, but Steve said to me one day, Cosma, you know that Augustine's African, don't you? And he said, no, I never thought about that. I said, yes, he was African, really. He was Mediterranean African. We don't really know what he looked like. But he clearly was not a Scot or an Irishman or a Frenchman. He was an African, actually. But Augustine, in the 5th century, when we would look back and call it the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Of course, he had no categories like that, no books to read by anybody making sense of the 5th century in Southern Europe, the Roman Empire in particular. He gets a letter one day by a man named Laurentius. It could have been Jay, a businessman in Atlanta. But Laurentius was a businessman in Rome. He writes to Bishop Augustine and says, what's going on in the world? I can't make sense of it. Again, he had no historical perspective. He had no centuries to look back on. He was just saying, our world is falling apart here. This eternal Roman Empire, things are not going very well. This is happening, and what this is going on. But what do Christians believe that can make sense of a time like this in history? And Augustine, with parchment and quill, wrote him a letter. The letter became known over the centuries as the Enchiridion. Really, probably the first catechism we have, maybe the longest known catechism we have in the Church's history. It probably is the most widely read piece of Augustine's Beyond City of God and Confessions, because it was a catechism used for 1,500 years. And he says in the letter that Christians believe in the Apostles' Creed, in the Lord's Prayer, in the theological virtues of faith and hope and love. And that's a long letter, and I've just summed it up in about 10 words there. But when he gets to the theological virtues, faith, hope, and love, teasing them out, he says, well, I could ask you, Patrick, what do you believe? What is your faith, actually? You could say, well, my faith is the Apostles' faith. But Augustine said, okay, but I still don't know much about who you are. And he presses into the meaning of hope. He said, but I could ask you, well, what do you long for? The impossible longing of Augustine tells us a lot about who we are, our longings, our hopes. But Augustine keeps pressing in and finally says, but you don't really know who someone is until you ask the question, what do you love? What do you love? What do you love? Because he says that question goes most deeply into what you love. And of course, if you know much about Augustine's work, his work was all about thinking about the ordering of our lives, getting our loves ordered rightly. And the disordering of our loves, not only do we implode, but our cities implode. So the city of God is a story, a long analysis of history of the whole world. We're looking at it in terms of two cities, the city of God and the city of man. The city of God is a rightly ordered love. The city of man built by what? Born of what? Of a love fixed on me, starting with me, ending with me. He said that kind of disordered love will always lead to the implosion of a city. It cannot be anything other than that. So Augustine writes the city of God while he's watching the Roman Empire fall apart. But here's a question in the Enchiridion, back to Laurentius, is a question which I want to leave with you tonight. What do you love? What do you love? If this is more of that deeper question for the whole evening, can you know the world and still love the world? I want you to think through for the hours you have tonight, maybe before we come back together tomorrow. So who am I then? That really is the heart of who I am. My loves. What I love. And what do I love? Walk your way back through the stories of the evening and take you through what has I given you to the question. But it is the question for tonight. So God bless you, brothers and sisters, and we'll talk for a while. Any questions you have now, okay? So,
I have no idea why this is on my mind, but
go ahead.
the Fiddler on the Roof. I can't remember what his wife is named, but Tevye.
Okay.
You know, they the play, the movie, the story is about their life together. And one of the things at the end of the great song he sings is, but do you love me?
Yes.
And so she's faced with trying to figure out, does she love him? And you can see her mind kind of going through this, that, and the other. And then finally she says, I suppose I do. It's kind of like, you pose a question, what do you love? Or how do you answer that question? And she answered the question in a very wonderful kind of way.
Wonderful kind of way.
But I'm not sure that that's not the same thing as to have knowledge and then responsibility for
It's
response.
the only way it is, though.
I'm not sure.
Isn't it? Just think about it. She's saying, well, I do this, I do this, I've done this, I've done these things. I mean, how? Of course I love you. You know? Maybe it hasn't been the romantic ideal she had Somebody had
She
in
doesn't
mind.
say, of course I love you. She
No.
says, I suppose I
We'll finish tomorrow morning with the idea of suppose, actually. So, it's a good word for us.
I think she comes around to saying what she said, but she creeps up.
I get what you're saying, yeah. Anybody else want to poke around about?
Yeah, we got a few minutes. We got about 6-7 minutes. So again, any questions that were sparked by other questions that were sparked by this conversation?
So here's another question. This is the question. So most of us live kind of regular lives. Some of them are kind of humdrum, it seems to me.
Most
Some
of us
are
do all day long.
everyday kind of situations. So we're not faced with the Tiananmen
We might not
Square
hear.
situation. And we are not faced with a revolutionary war. We gotta decide whether we want to stay under the British or whatever.
Right.
You know, those cataclysmic situations that don't come upon us. Some people with such loss and grief, they are faced with sort of cataclysmic things, because then they have to figure out how to draw strength to tolerate. But at any rate, so I'm trying to think of some little sort of thing that
How about bamboo
Affects
in your
me.
neighbor's yard?
how about what?
Bamboo in your neighbor's yard.
Terrible stuff.
Well, as I put it to you, the question for my wife, can she know me and still love me? It's a question I've thought about for a long time, actually, because I've had to.
Right.
I know myself, I think, well, I wouldn't like getting up to Steve. Is she still willing to love you? That's a pretty big deal. People ask me, this is literally true, because I want to be other than just an ordinary man that I am. How you doing, Steve? And I'll almost always say to anybody who asks me, my wife still loves me. Because I realize that's sort of like the barometer of my well-being. Like, if that wasn't true, I would probably be able to live tomorrow. My wife knows me, and she still loves me. I mean, I'm thinking about, again, I know almost nothing about you other than you were an OBGYN physician for a long time. You did cancer studies in Houston all the way. I'm sure, I mean, watching people die, watching the world. To watch disease and death, that can be numbing over time. So how do you keep your heart unnumbed? How do you, in some ways, go back again tomorrow, and we promised at the end of our liturgy week by week, to love and serve you this week, O Lord, with gladness and singleness of heart. Knowing I'm going to see you again tomorrow morning, and what is this? And what am I going to do with this? And what am I going to say to you, because you're a mother, you've got 3 little kids, and your husband, and what am I going to say to you now? Where will we go next week with this? I'm just imagining a little bit of maybe the conversations of your life. Okay. How do you somehow connect the liturgical promise, the commitment to love and serve you with gladness and singleness of heart again this week, knowing what I know about death and disease and death? Yeah.
That's great. Other questions?
Things like the idea of love and responsibility is a great antidote to very, very force that feels like consumption, which is, I think, the cynicism thing that you were referring to. Consumption and meaninglessness is, and so love and responsibility, if that can sort of take over our motivational structure of our heart.
Yeah.
That really is what flips the switch.
I think you're exactly right.
In any number of quote unquote vocations or occupations.
Little video you produced this past week, when you quoted about vocation and the vocation of God and imitating the vocation of God. For me, that is the heart of the whole thing, actually. Right. Because if there hasn't been an incarnation, friends, where God knew the world and still loved the world, we ought to just go home. This is all pretty silly after all. Because we're just sort of like twiddling our fingers in some way, on a Friday night. If there hasn't been an incarnation where, in fact, God knew the world and still loved it. Since we are Anglicans in the room tonight, I'm just going to throw out a wonderful name and a teacher to many of us, J.I. Packer. And his book for the ages called Knowing God. There's a chapter called Knowing and Being Known. In the very last paragraph of that chapter, he says something pretty close to these words. That God took knowledge of us in love. And there's nothing that we can say or do that will surprise him. That he knew the worst about us when he chose to love us. That's the gospel. And if that's who God is, then we're called to imitate Christ in the world, to be like God in the world. To me, that really is what I would say is the heart of what vocation is about. It's to be like God in the world, to know and to love like God knows and loves. If he knew the worst about us and still chose to love us, then you can say, well, that won't be me. I can't do that. I'm not going to do that. I don't believe in that. But in some ways, I would say, Pete, if you choose to go that way, there's a slow cycling down into some sense of meaninglessness over time. Why not then eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die? Why not then, actually? That's all there is left. If you're going to hunger for meaning, hunger for something more in your life, you have to have a basis for that, which is in some ways the question of those Tiananmen Square heroes that night. We're willing to suffer because you see, we love China. You understand its mess. We've been expelled. We can't go back until things change. But we will go back, even be imprisoned, because you see, we love China. So we know the worst about it. We'll take it into our hearts because we love it, even if we have to suffer for it. But that is global. It is cosmic in some ways. And I don't give it to you in a cheap way. But in some ways, I'm saying the story so that you realize that the questions we're thinking about tonight are questions that human beings all over the world have to think about. And sometimes they have higher stakes. Maybe that's instructive to us too, to realize, well, I'm okay. My question is more my neighbor's bamboo. Can I know my neighbor, still love my neighbor? Do my wife know me, still love me? Can I walk back into my practice tomorrow on Monday morning, when I'm going to see again this week people in pain, in inexplicable, complicated grief? What's happening to my body? And how am I going to take that in again today without becoming numbed to the sorrow of the world? But how do I, again this week, to love and serve you with gladness and singleness of heart? I have a son who's now 32 or so. I know he was Jonathan, 33. But when he was about 10, we were worshiping week by week at the Falls Church. We would come to this place in the liturgy at the end of our worship together. And when he was 10, he could do this. When he was 13, he stopped learning because he couldn't do that. When he was 10, he would put his head on my shoulder. We came to those words in the prayer at the end of this service. And it was like him saying to me, because he said to me one day, Daddy, I know these words mean a lot to you. So I'm just kind of putting my head here as your son because I realize that these are words you think a lot about. Because for me, they were like line in the sand words. To say either I will this week or I won't this week. Because I realize it's always going to cost me my life this week. To say again this week, I will love and serve you with gladness and singleness of heart again this week. Oh, it'll be a hard world this week. To hear this week, to see this week, I have to do this week. I'm not sure I'm going to promise it again this week like that. And so for a 10, 11, 12, he would every week put his head on my shoulder. At 13, he was too old anymore. He was kind of sad. Oh, Jonathan, come on. He could still do that, but he couldn't do that. But they're words that are lines in the sand for us. Go on.